Richard Langley was a man who had it all, or so everyone thought. He lived in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, drove luxury cars that turned heads wherever he went, and owned businesses that employed hundreds of people. To the outside world, Richard was the definition of success. But behind the polished exterior lay a life consumed by relentless ambition and endless work. For years, he chased deals, profits, and accolades, rarely taking time to pause or reflect on what truly mattered. His days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and late nights at the office. His weekends? More of the same. Friends tried to invite him out for dinners or vacations, but Richard always declined, saying he couldn't afford to slow down. "There's always another deal to close," he'd say with a smirk, as if his drive was something to be admired. And maybe it was to some extent. After all, Richard had built his empire from scratch, starting with nothing but a small loan and a big idea. But somewhere along the way he lost sight of balance. Family gatherings became rare, friendships faded, and even his own health took a backseat to his career. One fateful evening, Richard found himself stuck in yet another round of negotiations. A major client wanted to finalize a contract before the end of the week, and Richard refused to let anything stand in his way, not even sleep. It had been 3 days since he last rested properly, and exhaustion was creeping up on him. Still, he pushed through, fueled by coffee and sheer willpower. By midnight, the deal was finally done. Exhausted but victorious, Richard climbed into his sleek sports car and began the drive home. The roads were slick from an earlier rainstorm, but Richard barely noticed. His mind was still buzzing with thoughts of the day's accomplishments. As he sped along the highway, fatigue began to take its toll. His eyelids grew heavy, and for just a moment he drifted off. That split second was all it took. The car veered sharply, skidding across the wet pavement before slamming into a guardrail. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the once pristine vehicle came to rest in a mangled heap. Emergency services arrived quickly, pulling Richard from the wreckage. He was alive, but barely. Paramedics rushed him to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. Despite their best efforts, Richard slipped into a coma, his body shutting down as it struggled to recover from the trauma. Machines beeped steadily beside his bed, keeping track of his vitals while nurses bustled around, tending to his every need. Among those nurses was Emma Carter, a young woman with a heart as warm as her smile. Unlike many of her colleagues who saw comatose patients as little more than bodies to monitor, Emma approached each person with genuine care. She believed that even those in deep unconsciousness could sense kindness, and she treated Richard no differently. Every day she bathed him carefully, ensuring his skin stayed clean and free of irritation. She adjusted his blankets, checked his IV lines, and spoke softly to him, sharing bits and pieces of her own life as though he were listening. "Good morning, Mr. Langley," she'd say cheerfully, even though there was no response. "It's a beautiful day outside. The sun is shining and the birds are singing. I hope you can feel it somehow." Emma didn't know much about Richard beyond his name and the fact that he was wealthy. His expensive clothes and designer watch gave that away easily enough. But as she cared for him, she started to wonder about the man beneath the surface. What kind of person was he before the accident? Was he kind? Did he have family waiting anxiously for him to wake up? Or was he alone, like so many others in similar situations? Despite the uncertainty, Emma felt drawn to him. There was something almost peaceful about his presence, despite the chaos surrounding his condition. She imagined him as someone strong, perhaps too proud to admit vulnerability. Whatever the truth might be, Emma resolved to treat him with the same compassion she extended to everyone else under her care. Over the weeks that followed, Richard remained unresponsive. Doctors warned Emma and the rest of the medical team not to get their hopes up. Comas were unpredictable and recovery wasn't guaranteed. Yet Emma couldn't help but notice subtle changes. Sometimes his fingers twitched slightly, or his breathing pattern shifted. These tiny signs kept her hopeful, fueling her determination to keep providing the best care possible. Late one night, after finishing her shift, Emma lingered by Richard's bedside. The hospital was quiet save for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional footsteps of nighttime staff. Staring down at him, she whispered, "Come back to us, Mr. Langley. You're stronger than you think." Little did she know, her words carried more weight than she realized. Deep within Richard's unconscious mind, something stirred, a flicker of awareness, faint but persistent. Whether it was Emma's voice breaking through the darkness or simply his body's natural resilience, Richard began to fight his way back to consciousness. Though neither of them could see it yet, their lives were about to change forever. Every morning, Emma Carter began her shift with the same routine. She'd check the list of patients assigned to her, review their medical charts, and mentally prepare for the day ahead. Richard Langley's name always appeared at the top of her list. His case was unique, not just because he was in a coma, but because there was something about him that made her feel responsible for his recovery. It wasn't part of her job description, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she owed it to him to give her best. Bathing Richard became one of her most important tasks. At first, it felt like any other duty, meticulous, clinical, and necessary. Over time, however, it evolved into something more meaningful. Emma found herself talking to him as she worked, sharing snippets of her own life as though he were sitting across from her, listening intently. "You know," she'd say, "I used to hate mornings when I was younger, but now I kind of love them. There's something peaceful about starting fresh, don't you think?" She paused, glancing at his face for any sign of acknowledgement. Of course there was none, but that didn't stop her from continuing. Emma spoke about everything: her childhood growing up in a small town, her dreams of becoming a writer someday, and even the frustrations of working long hours in the hospital. Sometimes she'd tell funny stories about mishaps at work or describe the quirky habits of her coworkers. Occasionally, she'd bring up books she'd recently read or movies she'd watched, wondering aloud if Richard would have liked them too. "This one movie had this really stubborn character," she said once, smiling faintly. "He reminded me of you, actually, always pushing forward no matter what." Despite the lack of response, Emma never doubted that Richard could hear her, on some level. Nurses weren't supposed to get emotionally attached to patients, it was a rule drilled into them during training, but Emma couldn't help herself. Something about Richard's story resonated with her. Maybe it was the tragedy of seeing someone so accomplished reduced to such vulnerability. Or maybe it was the hope that deep down, he still had the strength to fight his way back. Her daily routine wasn't without challenges. Bathing a comatose patient required precision and patience, especially when dealing with sensitive areas. Emma approached the task with professionalism, ensuring Richard's dignity was preserved at all times. Still, there were moments when she wondered how he'd react if he woke up suddenly. Would he be embarrassed? Grateful? Angry? She pushed those thoughts aside, reminding herself that her priority was his well-being, not hypothetical scenarios. One afternoon, as Emma adjusted Richard's IV drip, something unusual caught her attention. His fingers twitched slightly, a movement so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. Startled, she froze, staring at his hand. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it, but then it happened again. This time, the twitch was unmistakable. Her heart raced as she pressed the call button for the attending physician. Within minutes, a team of doctors arrived, examining Richard thoroughly. They ran tests, checked his vitals, and studied the monitors for any signs of improvement. While they worked, Emma stood quietly in the corner, clutching her clipboard tightly. Her mind buzzed with questions. Could this mean he was getting better? Was he close to waking up? The lead doctor eventually turned to her, his expression cautious but hopeful. "It's a positive sign," he said. "Small movements like these can indicate neurological activity, but we need to be careful not to jump to conclusions. Recovery from a coma is unpredictable." Emma nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. She wanted to believe the twitching meant Richard was coming back, but she knew better than to expect miracles overnight. Still, the incident gave her renewed determination. From that day forward, she paid even closer attention to Richard, noting every tiny change in his condition. She started speaking to him more frequently, her voice filled with encouragement. "You're doing great, Mr. Langley," she'd say. "Keep fighting, we're all rooting for you." As the days passed, Emma noticed other signs of progress. Richard's breathing pattern became less labored, and his eyelids occasionally fluttered, as though he were dreaming. Once, while adjusting his pillows, Emma swore she saw a faint smile cross his lips. She leaned closer, unsure if she'd imagined it. "Did you hear me, Mr. Langley?" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "Are you still in there?" Though Richard didn't respond, Emma clung to the belief that he was aware of her presence. She began bringing small items from home to decorate his room: a potted plant, a framed photo of a sunset, a playlist of soothing music. Anything to make the sterile hospital environment feel warmer, more inviting. Each addition felt like a step toward coaxing him back to consciousness. Late one evening, after finishing her rounds, Emma lingered by Richard's bedside. The hospital was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She sat down in the chair beside him, folding her hands in her lap. For a while, she simply watched him, studying the lines of his face and imagining what he must have looked like before the accident. Strong, confident, maybe even intimidating. That's how she pictured him. Yet now he seemed almost fragile, vulnerable in a way that tugged at her heartstrings. "I wonder what your voice sounds like," she murmured softly. "Do you speak loudly, or are you the quiet type? Do you laugh often?" She chuckled lightly at her own musings. "I bet you're used to giving orders, aren't you? Everyone probably listens to you without question. But here you are, completely dependent on others. Must be strange for someone like you." Emma paused, leaning forward slightly. "But you're not alone, okay? You've got people who care about you. And even though I don't know much about your life, I promise I'll do everything I can to help you wake up." Her words hung in, the air heavy with sincerity. Whether Richard heard them or not, Emma hoped they carried some comfort, some reassurance that he wasn't forgotten. That night, as Emma left the hospital, she felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, worry, curiosity. They swirled together in her mind, keeping her awake long after she'd returned home. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over. What if Richard did wake up tomorrow? What would he say? How would he react to everything that had happened? And perhaps most importantly, would he remember her? Unbeknownst to Emma, her persistence was beginning to make an impact. Deep within Richard's unconscious mind, fragments of awareness stirred. Memories flickered like shadows on a wall, bits of conversations, laughter, warmth. Amid the haze, one image stood out clearly: a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice. Though Richard couldn't yet place her face or name, he sensed her presence, felt her care wrapping around him like a blanket. Slowly but surely, his body responded to her unwavering dedication, inching closer to the surface of consciousness. For now, neither Emma nor Richard realized the full extent of the bond forming between them. But as the days stretched into weeks, it became clear that their connection was stronger than either of them could have anticipated. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: their lives were intertwined in ways neither of them could have predicted. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. Emma had just finished her lunch break and returned to Richard's room, ready to resume her duties. The hospital corridors were quiet, the kind of calm that settles between shifts, when most visitors have gone home and the staff moves through their tasks with practiced efficiency. As she entered the room, she noticed something different about Richard. His chest rose and fell more steadily than before, and his face seemed relaxed, almost serene. She smiled softly, attributing it to her imagination, until she began preparing the supplies for his bath. Emma moved closer to the bed, speaking in her usual gentle tone. "All right, Mr. Langley, let's get you cleaned up," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of routine familiarity. She reached out to adjust the blanket, covering him, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. That's when it happened. His eyelids fluttered. For a moment, Emma froze, unsure if she'd seen it correctly. Then slowly, deliberately, Richard's eyes opened. They were clouded and unfocused at first, as though struggling to adjust to the light. But they were unmistakably open. Emma gasped, her hands trembling as she dropped the washcloth onto the tray beside her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she leaned closer, searching his face for any sign of recognition. "Mr. Langley," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can you hear me?" Richard blinked several times, his gaze wandering around the room before finally settling on her. For a fleeting second, there was clarity in his eyes, a spark of awareness that sent a jolt of hope through Emma. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and all that came out was a raspy sound. Still, the effort itself was enough to confirm what Emma already suspected. Richard was awake. Without hesitation, Emma pressed the call button for the medical team. Within moments, doctors and nurses rushed into the room, surrounding Richard's bed. Machines beeped urgently as they checked his vitals, examined his pupils, and ran tests to assess his condition. Emma stepped back, giving them space while trying to steady her breathing. Her mind raced with questions. How much did he remember? Would he recognize her? Was this truly the beginning of his recovery? The lead doctor turned to her after completing the initial assessment. "This is a significant development," he said, his tone measured but hopeful. "But we need to proceed cautiously. Awakening from a coma can be overwhelming for patients, both physically and mentally. We'll monitor him closely and adjust treatment accordingly." Emma nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop staring at Richard, who now lay quietly in the bed, his eyes half closed. The flurry of activity around him seemed distant, almost surreal. All she could focus on was the fact that he was awake, alive, and she had been there to witness it. Over the next few hours, Richard drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was alert, the medical team asked him simple questions to gauge his cognitive function. "Do you know where you are?" one doctor asked gently. Richard hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "What's your name?" another prompted. This time he managed a hoarse reply. Richard." It wasn't much, but it was progress. Emma stayed by his side as much as possible, offering reassurance whenever he seemed confused or disoriented. "You're safe here, Mr. Langley," she told him softly. "You've been through a lot, but you're going to be okay. Just take your time." As the days passed, Richard grew stronger, though his memory remained fragmented. He recalled bits and pieces of his past, the crash, the rain-soaked road, the blinding headlights, but larger chunks of his life felt like they belonged to someone else. Strangely, one thing stood out vividly: Emma. Though he couldn't explain why, her presence felt familiar, comforting even. Every time she entered the room, he felt a sense of relief wash over him, as though her mere existence anchored him to reality. One morning, as Emma adjusted his pillows, Richard mustered the courage to ask her a question. "Why do I feel like I know you?" His voice was still weak, but the curiosity in his tone was undeniable. Emma paused, surprised by his words. She smiled faintly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've been taking care of you since you were brought here," she explained. "You've been in a coma for months, so I don't think you'd remember me. But I've been talking to you every day, hoping you could hear me." Richard frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together the fragments of his memory. "Talking to me?" he echoed. "About what?" "All sorts of things," Emma replied with a small laugh. "My day, my dreams, random stories. I figured it couldn't hurt. Some people believe patients in comas can still hear, even if they can't respond. I guess I wanted to make sure you didn't feel alone." Her words struck a chord deep within Richard. He didn't fully understand why, but the idea of her sitting by his bedside, sharing parts of her life with him, stirred something inside him. It was as though her kindness had seeped into his subconscious, leaving an indelible mark. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't remember much, but I think I heard you. Somewhere." Emma's cheeks flushed, caught off guard by his sincerity. "Well, I'm glad you're awake now," she said quickly, changing the subject. "How are you feeling today? Any better?" Richard hesitated, glancing around the room. "Tired," he admitted, "and Lost. Like I'm missing huge pieces of my life. Do you think I'll ever get them back? I don't know, Emma replied honestly. But you're doing great so far. Just take it one day at a time, okay? You've already come so far. Their conversations became a regular part of Richard's recovery process. Each interaction revealed more about the man beneath the scars. Not the wealthy businessman he once was, but someone searching for meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. Emma learned that Richard had spent years chasing success, sacrificing relationships and personal happiness along the way. Now lying in a hospital bed, he found himself questioning whether it had all been worth it. You built an empire, Emma said one afternoon, flipping through a magazine as Richard rested. That's impressive. Most people only dream of achieving what you did. Richard sighed, staring at the ceiling. An empire doesn't mean much when you're lying here wondering if anyone cares you're alive, he muttered. I thought money and power would protect me, make me untouchable. Turns out, none of it matters when you're fighting for your life. Emma set the magazine aside, turning to face him. Maybe this is your chance to redefine what matters, she suggested gently. Not everyone gets a second chance like this. You could use it to build something new, something that makes you happy. Richard mulled over her words, letting them sink in. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of change. What if he didn't go back to the life he once knew? What if he used this opportunity to create something meaningful instead? As the days turned into weeks, Richard's physical strength improved, and his memories gradually returned. He remembered his lavish penthouse, his fleet of luxury cars, and the endless deals that had consumed his life. But those memories no longer held the same allure. Instead, he found himself focusing on the present, the quiet moments shared with Emma, the kindness of the hospital staff, the simple joy of watching sunlight stream through the window. One evening, as Emma prepared to leave for the day, Richard stopped her with a soft request. Will you come back tomorrow? He asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability. Emma smiled warmly, touched by his sincerity. Of course, she replied. I'll be here. As she walked out of the room, Richard watched her go, a strange sensation stirring in his chest. It wasn't gratitude or admiration. It was deeper, more profound. For the first time in years, he felt connected to another human being in a way that transcended wealth, status, or ambition. And though he couldn't yet put it into words, he knew one thing for certain. Emma Carter had changed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. As Richard grew stronger, the hospital staff began encouraging him to take short walks around the ward. At first, he needed assistance, leaning heavily on a nurse or a walker as he shuffled along the sterile corridors. But with each passing day, his steps became steadier, his confidence growing alongside his physical strength. These walks gave him time to reflect, to observe the world beyond the confines of his hospital room. The bustling activity of doctors and nurses, the soft murmur of conversations between patients and visitors, it all felt foreign yet strangely comforting. Emma often accompanied him during these outings, her presence a source of reassurance. She'd push his IV stand beside him, ready to lend a hand if he stumbled. They rarely spoke during these moments. Instead, they enjoyed a comfortable silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of Richard's footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. Yet even in silence, there was an unspoken connection between them, a bond forged through months of care and shared vulnerability. One afternoon, as they strolled past the hospital garden, Emma suggested they step outside. The fresh air might do you good, she said, glancing at him with a hopeful smile. Richard hesitated, unsure if he was ready to venture outdoors, but something in her expression convinced him to agree. Together, they made their way to the small courtyard nestled within the hospital grounds. The garden was modest but beautiful, filled with vibrant flowers, lush greenery, and benches where patients could sit and soak in the sunshine. Birds chirped overhead, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine. For Richard, it felt like stepping into another world, one untouched by the sterile walls and beeping machines that had defined his existence for so long. They settled onto a bench beneath a shady tree, the warmth of the sun filtering through. the leaves above. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tranquility wash over him. When he opened them again, he turned to Emma, his gaze thoughtful. "This place is nice," he said, his voice tinged with appreciation. "I didn't realize hospitals had gardens like this. It's one of my favorite spots," Emma admitted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes when things get overwhelming, I come here to clear my head. It reminds me that life goes on, even in the toughest times." Richard nodded, slowly, absorbing her words. He wanted to ask her more, about her struggles, her dreams, the things that kept her going, but he wasn't sure how to phrase the questions without seeming intrusive. Instead, he found himself sharing fragments of his own thoughts. "Before the accident, I never took time to notice places like this," he confessed. "I was always rushing, chasing deadlines, making deals. Now, I feel like I'm seeing the world differently." Emma tilted her head, studying his face. "Different how?" "I don't know," Richard replied, pausing to gather his thoughts. "It's like, before, everything was about results. Success was measured in numbers, profits, contracts, achievements. But now I see beauty in the little things. The sunlight on the grass, the sound of birds singing, the kindness of people like you. It's strange, isn't it? How losing everything made me realize what truly matters." Emma smiled softly, touched by his honesty. "Maybe it's not strange," she said. "Sometimes we need to lose something to understand its value. You've been given a second chance, Mr. Langley. What you do with it is up to you." Her words lingered in the air, planting a seed of possibility in Richard's mind. Over the next few days, he found himself reflecting on them constantly. Memories of his former life returned in waves, bringing with them a mix of pride and regret. He remembered the thrill of closing multi-million-dollar deals, the satisfaction of building his empire from scratch, but he also recalled the emptiness that followed, the lonely nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why success hadn't brought him happiness. During one of their walks, Richard decided to share some of these memories with Emma. "I used to think money could solve every problem," he admitted, his tone heavy with self-awareness. "But the truth is, it just created new ones. My friends weren't really friends, they were business associates who disappeared the moment I crashed. My family, well, let's just say we haven't been close in years. And then there's me, the man who sacrificed everything for success, only to end up here." Emma listened quietly, her expression empathetic. "It sounds lonely," she said gently. "But maybe this is your opportunity to change that, to build relationships based on trust and love, rather than transactions." Richard mulled over her words, realizing how much wisdom lay behind her simple statement. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where he prioritized connection over conquest, compassion over competition. And somehow, Emma seemed to embody the qualities he admired most: resilience, kindness, and authenticity. One night, as Richard drifted off to sleep, he experienced a vivid dream. In it, he stood in complete darkness, surrounded by shadows that pressed in on him from all sides. Panic gripped him as he struggled to move to escape the suffocating void. Just as despair threatened to consume him, a soft light appeared in the distance. Slowly it grew brighter, illuminating the figure of a young woman standing before him. It was Emma. She held a basin of water in her hands, her movements deliberate and graceful as she knelt beside him. With tender care, she began washing his arms, her touch warm and reassuring. Her voice echoed softly in the vast emptiness, filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't known existed. "You're not alone," she whispered, her words resonating deep within his soul. When Richard awoke, tears streamed down his face, though he couldn't explain why. The dream felt too real, too significant to dismiss as mere imagination. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. Was it guilt? Gratitude? Something else entirely? Later that morning, Emma entered his room with a cheerful greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Langley. How are you feeling today?" she asked, setting down the tray of supplies she carried. Richard hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject of his dream. Finally, he decided to start with something simpler. "Do you believe in miracles?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "Miracles? Like divine intervention or something?" "Not exactly," Richard replied, shaking his head. "More like moments where everything changes, where you suddenly see things clearly even if you can't explain why." Emma thought for a moment, then smiled. "I guess I do. Life has a funny way of surprising us when we least expect it." "Why do you ask?" Richard looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Because I think I've experienced one," he said finally. "And I think it has something to do with you." Emma blinked, caught off guard by his admission. A blush crept into her cheeks as she fumbled for a response. "Me? I'm just doing my job, Mr. Langley. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Richard insisted, his voice firm despite the raspiness. "It's more than that. You've shown me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return. You've reminded me what it means to be human. That's not something everyone would do." Emma lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. She had always prided herself on being compassionate, but hearing Richard acknowledge it so openly left her feeling vulnerable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, Emma broke the silence with a soft laugh. "Well, if I've helped you see the world differently, then I'm glad, but don't give me too much credit. I'm just a nurse." "You're more than that," Richard countered, his tone unwavering. "You've saved me in ways I can't fully put into words, and I'll never forget it." Their conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. From that day forward, Richard began opening up more, sharing pieces of his past and his hopes for the future. Emma listened, patiently, offering advice when needed but never pushing him to reveal more than he was comfortable with. In return, Richard learned about her dreams of becoming a writer, her struggles balancing work and personal aspirations, and the quiet determination that drove her every day. Together, they discovered a mutual love for storytelling, books, movies, and the art of crafting narratives. They spent hours discussing their favorite characters, debating plot twists, and imagining alternate endings. These exchanges brought them closer, bridging the gap between patient and caregiver until it dissolved entirely. As weeks turned into months, Richard's recovery progressed steadily. He regained enough independence to leave the hospital, though the thought of saying goodbye to Emma filled him with unease. He knew their paths might diverge once he stepped back into the outside world, but he couldn't bear the idea of losing the connection they had built. On the eve of his discharge, Richard sat in his wheelchair, staring out the window at the city skyline. Emma approached him quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Richard sighed, turning to face her. "I don't know," he admitted. "Leaving feels scary, not because of the accident, but because of what comes next. What if I forget everything I've learned here? What if I go back to being the person I was before?" Emma squeezed his shoulder gently. "You won't," she said with conviction, "because you've already changed. This experience has shaped you in ways no one else can undo. Trust yourself, Mr. Langley. You're stronger than you think." Her words stayed with him. The day Richard left the hospital was bittersweet. He had spent months within those walls, a place that had once symbolized his fragility, but now represented the beginning of his transformation. As he packed the few belongings he had accumulated, a notebook, some clothes kindly donated by the hospital staff, and a small potted plant Emma had given him, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Leaving meant stepping back into a world he no longer recognized, one where he wasn't sure how to fit in anymore. Emma accompanied him to the hospital entrance, her presence grounding him amidst the whirlwind of emotions. The morning sun cast golden rays over the pavement, and the air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. It was a beautiful day, yet Richard felt uneasy, as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to leap or retreat. "Well, Emma said with a warm smile breaking the silence. "This is it. You're officially free." Richard chuckled nervously, adjusting the strap of his bag. "Free? I'm not so sure about that. Feels more like starting over." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Starting over isn't such a bad thing. Think of it as a blank page. You get to write whatever story you want this time." Her words struck a chord deep within him. Over the past few months, Emma had taught him to see life differently, to find beauty in simplicity, joy in connection and purpose beyond material success. Now, as he stood at the threshold of his new journey, he realized just how much she had influenced him. She had become more than a caregiver. She was a guide, a friend, and perhaps something even deeper. "Will you come visit me?" Richard blurted out, suddenly surprising himself with the question. His cheeks flushed and he quickly added, "I mean, if you're not too busy." Emma laughed softly, her eyes twinkling. "Of course I'll visit, but don't think I'm letting you off the hook that easily. You promised to rebuild your life, remember? I plan to hold you accountable." Richard smiled, feeling a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. "Good. I could use someone to keep me honest." With a final wave, Emma watched him step into the waiting cab. As the car pulled away, she stood there for a moment, watching until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did she turn and head back inside, unaware of the profound impact their bond would have on both their lives. Life outside the hospital proved to be both liberating and daunting for Richard. For years, his identity had been tied to his wealth and achievements. Now, stripped of those things, he struggled to define who he was. Many of his former associates had distanced themselves after the accident, assuming he was no longer useful to them. His penthouse had been sold to cover mounting medical bills, and his businesses had crumbled under mismanagement during his coma. What remained was a modest savings account, enough to sustain him for a while, but far from the fortune he once commanded. At first, Richard felt adrift, overwhelmed by the enormity of rebuilding his life from scratch. He rented a small apartment downtown, its bare walls and creaky floors a stark contrast to the luxury he was accustomed to. Yet, instead of despairing, he found solace in the simplicity. Gone were the extravagant parties and endless meetings. In their place was quiet solitude, interrupted only by the occasional call from Emma checking in on him. During one of these calls, Emma suggested they meet for coffee. "You've been cooped up in that apartment long enough," she teased. "Come out and enjoy some fresh air. Besides, I owe you a cup for all those stories you told me." Richard hesitated, unsure if he was ready to face the outside world. But the idea of seeing Emma again gave him courage. They agreed to meet at a cozy cafe near the park, its rustic charm a perfect backdrop for their reunion. When Richard arrived, Emma greeted him with a hug, her warmth instantly putting him at ease. Over steaming cups of coffee, they talked about everything: the challenges of adjusting to civilian life, the quirky habits of hospital patients, and the books they'd recently read. For the first time in months, Richard felt a sense of normalcy, as though he were simply catching up with an old friend, rather than navigating uncharted territory. "You seem different," Emma remarked at one point, studying his face. "More relaxed, maybe?" Richard shrugged, smiling faintly. "I guess I am. Living without the pressure of running an empire has its perks. Funny, isn't it? I spent my whole life chasing success, only to realize it doesn't bring happiness." Emma leaned forward, her expression earnest. "So what does bring happiness? If you could design your ideal life right now, what would it look like?" Richard paused, considering her question. "Connection," he said finally. "Not just with people, but with myself. I want to live authentically, without pretending, to be someone I'm not. And I want to make a difference, not for fame or money, but because it feels right." Emma beamed, clearly pleased with his answer. "That's a great start. Now all you need is a plan." Inspired by their conversation, Richard began exploring ways to give back to the community. He remembered Emma's passion for supporting nurses and healthcare workers, and an idea took root in his mind. Why not channel his remaining resources into creating something meaningful? something that honored the dedication and sacrifices of people like her. Over the next few weeks, Richard poured his energy into researching nonprofit organizations, consulting experts, and drafting proposals. He reached out to former colleagues who still respected his vision, asking for advice and support. Slowly, but surely his dream began to take shape. A foundation dedicated to improving working conditions for nurses, providing scholarships for aspiring caregivers, and raising awareness about the vital role they played in society. Emma was thrilled when Richard shared his plans with her. "This is incredible," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "You're turning your second chance into something amazing. I can't wait to see what you accomplish." With Emma's encouragement, Richard threw himself into the project, working tirelessly to bring it to fruition. He leased office space, hired a small team, and partnered with local hospitals to launch pilot programs. Every decision he made was guided by gratitude for the care he had received, for the lessons he had learned, and for the woman who had inspired it all. As the foundation gained momentum, Richard invited Emma to join him on stage at its official launch event. Standing before a crowd of donors, volunteers, and healthcare professionals, he delivered a heartfelt speech. None of this would have been possible without the compassion and resilience of nurses like Emma Carter, he said, gesturing toward her. "She reminded me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the connections we forge and the lives we touch." The audience erupted in applause, and Emma blushed, overwhelmed by his praise. Later that evening, as they strolled through the city streets illuminated by twinkling lights, Richard turned to her, his voice soft but resolute. "You saved me, Emma, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I'll never be able to repay you, but I hope this is a start." Emma shook her head, her smile radiant. "You don't owe me anything, Richard. This is your journey. I'm just glad I got to be part of it." In that moment, surrounded by the hum of urban life and the glow of newfound purpose, Richard realized the full extent of the miracle Emma had sparked. She hadn't just nursed him back to health. She had reignited his soul, showing him that even in loss there is potential for growth. Together, they had transformed tragedy into triumph, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the simplest acts of kindness. And as they walked side by side, hand in hand, Richard knew one thing for certain. His second chance wasn't just about rebuilding his life. It was about building a future worth sharing. The foundation's launch marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Richard, but for Emma as well. Her role in Richard's recovery had been acknowledged publicly, and she found herself thrust into the spotlight in ways she never expected. While Richard worked tirelessly to grow the nonprofit, Emma became its unofficial ambassador, sharing her experiences as a nurse and advocating for better support systems within the healthcare industry. Together, they made an unstoppable team. Richard, with his vision and resources, and Emma with her passion and first-hand knowledge. Their partnership extended beyond professional endeavors. Over time, their bond deepened, evolving into something neither of them could have anticipated. What started as gratitude on Richard's part and compassion on Emma's transformed into mutual admiration and eventually love. They spent countless evenings discussing ideas for the foundation, brainstorming ways to expand its reach and impact. But it wasn't all work. They also laughed over shared meals, took long walks through the park, and discovered common interests like photography and hiking. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraising gala, Richard invited Emma to join him on the rooftop of his modest apartment building. The city stretched out before them, a glittering tapestry of lights against the dark sky. A gentle breeze carried the faint sounds of distant traffic and laughter from nearby streets. "I've been thinking," Richard began, his tone unusually serious, "about how much has changed since that night at the hospital." Emma tilted her head, curious. "In what way?" "Well," he said, hesitating for a moment. "Back then, I thought my life was over. I felt lost, broken, like I had nothing left to give. But now, I feel whole again, and I owe that to you." Emma smiled softly, touched by his words. "You don't owe me anything, Richard. You did the hard work yourself. I just gave you a little push." "No," he insisted, shaking his head. It was more than that. You showed me what it means to live, not just exist, but truly live. You taught me to value kindness, connection, and purpose. Without you, I wouldn't be here today. Emma's heart swelled with emotion, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she let him continue, sensing that he needed to say this. And now, Richard went on, his voice growing steadier, I want to ask you something. Something important. He paused, turning to face her fully. Taking a deep breath, he knelt down on one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Emma gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Inside the box lay a simple yet elegant diamond ring, its brilliance catching the moonlight. Emma Carter, Richard said, his eyes shining with sincerity. You've saved me in every way possible. You've shown me the beauty in humanity, the power of compassion, and the importance of second chances. Will you do me the honor of spending the rest of your life with me? Tears streamed down Emma's face as she stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. For years, she had dedicated herself to caring for others, often putting her own dreams on hold. But now standing before her was a man who saw her for who she truly was. A kind, resilient, extraordinary woman, and who wanted to build a future with her. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, I will. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, a wide grin spreading across his face. He pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as though afraid she might disappear. In that instant, both of them knew they had found something rare and precious. A love born not out of convenience or fleeting attraction, but out of shared struggle, growth, and unwavering support. As news of their engagement spread, friends, family, and colleagues celebrated the union of two people who seemed destined to find each other. The foundation flourished under their joint leadership, expanding its programs to include mental health support for healthcare workers, educational scholarships for aspiring nurses, and community outreach initiatives. Their story inspired countless others, reminding people that even in the darkest moments, hope and transformation are possible. On the day of their wedding, held in a picturesque garden bathed in sunlight, Richard stood at the altar, his heart pounding with anticipation. As Emma walked down the aisle in a flowing white dress escorted by her proud parents, he couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. From a sterile hospital room to this joyous celebration, their journey had been nothing short of miraculous. During his vows, Richard spoke directly to Emma, his voice filled with emotion. When I woke up in that hospital bed, I didn't know who I was anymore. But you reminded me that identity isn't fixed. It's shaped by the choices we make and the people we choose to surround ourselves with. You chose me, even when I had nothing to offer. And because of you, I've become someone I'm proud to be. Emma, tears streaming down her cheeks, echoed his sentiments. Richard, you've taught me that strength isn't about having everything figured out. It's about being willing to start over, to learn and to grow. You've given me a partner, a best friend, and a soulmate. I can't wait to see where this next chapter takes us. After the ceremony, guests mingled beneath twinkling fairy lights, sharing stories and laughter. Nurses who had worked alongside Emma recounted humorous anecdotes from the hospital, while former business associates marveled at Richard's transformation. The atmosphere buzzed with warmth and celebration, a testament to the ripple effect of kindness and resilience. Later that night, as Richard and Emma danced under the stars, Richard leaned in close, whispering in her ear, "Do you remember that dream I told you about? The one where you were washing my arms and telling me I wasn't alone?" Emma nodded, smiling. "Of course. Why?" "I think I understand it now," he said, his gaze tender. "It wasn't just a dream. It was a promise that no matter how dark things got, you'd be there to guide me back to the light. And you kept that promise, Emma. Every single day." Emma rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We're partners now, Richard. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And so, hand in hand, they stepped into their future, a future built not on wealth or status, but on love, purpose, and gratitude. Their story served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations occur not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments of human connection. Through loss, recovery, and renewal, Richard and Emma proved that miracles aren't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they arrive quietly, wrapped in the warmth of a kind word, a gentle touch, or a steadfast presence. As the music played and the crowd cheered, Richard and Emma embraced, knowing that their journey was far from over. Together, they would continue to inspire, to heal, and to create a legacy rooted in compassion. Because in the end, it wasn't the accident, the coma, or the foundation that defined them. It was the love they shared and the lives they touched along the way.